The day started out like any other day. I was sitting by the city gate, silently holding out my hand, begging for coins. I was blind, so begging was my only choice. Quietly begging. You see, it wasn't customary for beggars to shout. We sit quietly, hands outstretched, hoping for some meager coins from sympathetic strangers. But on that day, Jesus came to town. Jesus. I'd heard he was a healer, and when the crowd told me he was passing right by where I was sitting, something stirred deep inside me. I just had to shout his name. Jesus, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. People tried to make me be quiet, but I kept shouting. And then he stopped. He stopped and he asked me what I wanted him to do for me. What an odd question to ask. I mean, wasn't it obvious? What more could a blind beggar want than to see? But he didn't assume. He didn't assume to know what I wanted, even though he could see what I needed. So he asked. He met me where I live, and he asked. This miracle worker asked me what I wanted. I told him I wanted to see, and immediately my sight was restored. I was healed.
You know, one of the remarkable things that is becoming more and more obvious in our study of stories of people who encounter Jesus is just how personal these encounters were. By personal, I don't simply mean deeply meaningful. What I mean is that each encounter was unique, like Jesus not only knew the need, but also just the right way to affirm each person. Just the right thing to say to them, and at times just the right thing to require of them. I think of the conversation with the Canaanite woman, where it seemed to us she had to work pretty hard. As Jesus reminded her that he was sent for the people of Israel, and she was an outsider. We wrestled with just that conversation and how it looked like he was kind of putting her off, and yet maybe at the same time he was drawing from her faith and evidence of that faith in front of the crowd that was around her. And even perhaps as a lesson to the disciples as he raised this odd question, but is it really right to take the food from the children and give it to the dogs? She replied, yes, but even the dogs get crumbs from the master's table. And we marvel at that, and we questioned that, but we wrestled with that and saw some new aspects of maybe what was really going on in that story, and just how personal that was, and how through that story this woman is seen as a woman of great courage, of great faith, even wit, in that as she kind of matched wits with Jesus in that moment and responded in those ways. And we don't know all of the reasons for that, but we sense there was something very personal going on between Jesus and that woman. We think of Zacchaeus and the way his encounter with Jesus changed his life. And similarly, unlike other encounters, it wasn't a physical healing for him. It was so much more than that. And what led Zacchaeus to want to see Jesus and then to climb the tree, and of course, that's all the emphasis. We think, oh yeah, that's a great story, but so much more as Jesus affirmed him, as Jesus knew just what it would be that would open the floodgates in his spirit. All of these walls that he had built up around him, all these ways that he interacted with the world around him, and maybe as was suggested when we looked at this story, maybe ways that he thought he was entitled, he thought he deserved to be able to take from others in response to the ways that they had treated him. And all of that just just opened right up. And somehow that experience of Jesus' affirmation of him, Jesus wanting to be with him, Jesus saying, I value you, even in his invitation, or it wasn't really an invitation, wasn't it? Was it? He said, I'm going to go have lunch with you, and you're home. But it was an invitation. It was an invitation to be in relationship, and something about that just completely undid Zacchaeus. Changed him from the inside out. The two encounters we visited last week, we didn't get as much as far as the backstory. We imagined, but we weren't told quite as much, and yet in those cases, Jesus is the one who initiated. Jesus is the one who went to those people. He saw the need, and he went. And to the woman who was burying her son, he said, don't cry. And he brought life out of death. To the woman who was crippled, then for 18 years, bent over, could not even look up and see people eye to eye. There in the synagogue, Jesus called her forward as a woman. And he set her free from her suffering. Well, today's story may not seem particularly remarkable, except for the part where Jesus heals a man's blindness. I hope we don't ever lose sight of the remarkable nature of all of these things. But I believe there's even more here for us to see. In our reading earlier, we read from the New Living Translation, and I like that in many regards, in the way that it kind of gives me a fresh read of the story, kind of simplifies things. But there's some things that translation leaves out. That translation leaves out. Maybe they're not the most powerful parts of the story, but I want to read it out of the New American Standard Bible, widely regarded as probably one of the most reliable literal translations. It doesn't mean it always communicates best to everybody, but if you want to go, okay, I want to make sure just how this was, and you're not a Greek scholar, it's always a good one to check. So I'm going to read this, and maybe some things will jump out to you that you say, oh, I didn't notice that before. But if they don't, we'll talk about them for a few minutes. It says, then they came to Jericho, and as he, that is Jesus, was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a large crowd, a blind beggar named Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the road. When he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Many were sternly telling him to be quiet, but he kept crying out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him here. So they called the blind man, saying to him, take courage, stand up, he is calling for you. Throwing aside his cloak, he jumped up and came to Jesus. And answering him, Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabboni, I want to regain my sight. And Jesus said to him, Go, your faith has made you well. Immediately he regained his sight and began following him on the road. Now this story appears in 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Some of the details differ a little. Matthew indicates that there was actually a second blind man who was healed at this time. He doesn't give either names, but by comparison, it's pretty clear that it's the same story. All 3 writers have Bartimaeus And in Matthew's case, the two blind men crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." An interesting side note here, son of David is a term for the Messiah. And one might suggest that even at this point in his life, the possibility that Bartimaeus, this blind man, saw things that other people couldn't see. Maybe he had already come to a place in his faith where he believed that this Jesus of Nazareth was in fact the Messiah, as he referred to him in this way. "Son of David, have mercy on me." All three accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have the crowds first telling him to be quiet, sternly rebuking him. Kind of gives me the impression that they were wanting to make an impression. Jesus was visiting their town. They'd come out to welcome him, and I mean, isn't that kind of human nature? We want our town to look good. There's a big convention coming into our city, so we need to clean up the streets. We don't want our visitors to see the homeless. We don't want our visitors to see the needy in our city, so we kind of shoo them away. I tend to think maybe that's what was going on here. All three accounts have Bartimaeus shouting even louder. Because now it's not just the noise of the crowd, it's the people saying, be quiet, hush. Shouting even louder. All three accounts have Jesus stopping and calling. At this point, Mark's the only one who gives the next few details. Mark's the one who shows the crowd changing course. The other gospel writers, and not that they're in conflict, they just tell different parts of the story. The other gospel writers have Jesus stopping and calling, and then it just moves right to the conversation. But Mark says that when Jesus said this, that the crowd, and Jesus actually didn't say, Bartimaeus, come. He turned to the crowd that was between him and this blind man crying out for mercy. Jesus says, in this case, to the crowd, call him here. So they, that is the crowd, called the blind man, saying to him, hey, guess what? Take courage. Stand up. He's calling for you. Is there a lesson there for us? Might there be times when there are people that we write off as unreachable or less important? People that we might be party to trying to marginalize. And then somehow we are reminded of God's love for this person. And we go from being discouraging, we go from being judging. We become reminded that God has called us to be messengers, to say, come, he's calling for you. Come, he's calling for you. Then, as Mark records, Bartimaeus says he threw off his cloak, he jumped up, and he came to Jesus. And as we've heard several times already, Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus replies, my teacher. Once again, this may be an expression of his faith that has already been growing in this man he's never met before. You say, well, why do you say that? Well, the first reading we did, he simply says rabbi, but the actual word here is Rabboni. And it really means my teacher. He's personalizing it. He says, this is who you are to me. And he says to him, my teacher, I want to see. Interesting. This other translation in the Greek language gives the indication that he was not blind from birth in this instance. John 9 records a story of a different encounter, a man who was blind from birth. But literally this man is saying, I want to see again. I want to regain my sight. And he was healed. Jesus restored his sight. And he began following Jesus on the road. I'd love to know more of his story. I'd love to know the backstory to this, but all we have is what we have. But there are three things I want to come back to that I believe can speak to us, whatever our circumstances, wherever we might be. Three simple truths, whatever translation you read. The first is that Jesus called for Bartimaeus. Even though he used the crowd and even though he asked the crowd to call him, Jesus was still calling for Bartimaeus. The crowd understood that. They went to Bartimaeus. They said, get up on your feet. He's calling for you. Jesus called Bartimaeus. Secondly, Bartimaeus came to Jesus. And thirdly, Bartimaeus confessed his desire, his need. And I'd like to focus just for the last few moments here this morning on those three aspects of the story. I'd like to ask, where are you in this story? I know I started talking about how every encounter is unique and is very personal, but there is a sense in which the encounters that God continues to initiate today, the encounters between people and God, there is and needs to be these three components. An awareness that he's calling. A response on our part to come. And a response on our part to name, to confess our need, what it is that we want. And so again, I ask, where are you in this part of the story? I don't mean just in Bartimaeus' story, I mean in your story. Would you say, yes, I've heard Jesus call? How that happened probably is different from one person to another. Maybe, as in Bartimaeus' case, he used other people. Maybe that call came through someone else who came to you in some way and who communicated to you, he's calling for you. Maybe it came through some circumstance. Maybe it came through reading the scriptures on your own. Whatever the situation, have you heard Jesus call personally? Second question, have you responded? Bartimaeus' case, it says he threw off his cloak, he jumped to his feet, and he came. What does it mean to respond? Sometimes maybe it does mean to jump to your feet. Sometimes it may mean to throw off whatever it is that might get in our way of coming to him. Well, there's a lot of things that might get in our way, a lot of reasons, a lot of excuses that we might make and say, oh, no, I can't, or but if I do, then maybe, or what if, and we need to throw off whatever it is that might get in our way. In essence, jump to our feet and come. And then Jesus says to you, what do you want me to do for you? And now what do you say? What did you say? What are you saying now as we think about this? What is it that you want? What do you want me to do for you? Is it health? Is it a long life? Is it wealth? Just a little more money? Is it success in some endeavor? Is it a name for yourself? You might be thinking, yeah, I'd like to ask for all those things, but somehow this is church. It's probably the wrong things to ask for, right? I mean, those are all pretty big, right? Those are all pretty big things to ask. Well, I want to suggest the problem is not that they're too big. The problem is that they're too small. I want to share the words of a song that has recently come to my attention, and it just, it really, I think, speaks to this. It's a song, singer Natalie Grant. The song's called More Than Anything. It starts off saying, I know if you wanted to, you could wave your hand. Spare me this heartache, change your plan, and I know that any second you can take away my pain. But even if you don't, I pray. And here's the prayer. Help me want the healer more than the healing. Help me want the Savior more than the saving. Help me want the giver more than I want the giving. Oh, help me want you, Jesus, more than anything. The next verse, you know more than anyone that my flesh is weak, and you know that I'd give anything for a remedy. And I'll ask 1,000 more times to set me free today. Oh, but even if you don't, I pray. Help me want the healer even more than the healing. Help me want the Savior even more than the saving. Help me want the giver even more than the giving. Oh, help me want you, Jesus, more than anything. All these other things we might ask for are really too small compared to Jesus. What do you want me to do for you? I think of the tax collector in the temple. His prayer was, God, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner. What do you want me to do for you? How about, God, forgive me? God, teach me. God, change me. God, lead me. God, use me. Would But Bartimaeus, he was honest about what was right in front of him, and that was not condemn. God, I want to see again. My teacher, I want to see again. God met that need. But then we're told that Bartimaeus began following Jesus. God met that small thing and gave him something even bigger. We all have a lot of needs in our lives. But the greatest thing we could want, where God wants to lead us, when Jesus invites us to come to him, it's yes, come and trust me with all these areas of your life. Come and trust me with your health. Come and trust me with your financial needs. Come and trust me with all of life. But what I really want to give you is myself. I want you to come to me, be in relationship with me, and let us walk through life together. Have you heard Jesus call? Have you come to him?